Okay, so today's topic is going to be podcasting and what to do. So tell me, what do you think of when you think of a podcast? What comes to mind on all of that?
Information.
It's all about information, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. What are some of do you listen to podcasts right now on any kind of a regular basis? Are there any specific people that you're following or listening to?
I actually kind of have like a list, like
Okay.
Bren Brown. I listen to her. She's really good.
Okay. When you do listen,
Mm-hmm.
do you feel like you're being sold or you're being informed?
I feel like I'm being informed on some things, and then when they do all the ads,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I'm getting sold. So I feel like that there's, it's not as genuine. I mean, I
Yeah.
understand that they have to do the advertisement to get their sponsorships, but
Right. That's how they make money.
I know, but I'm just like, wow,
Yeah.
this is like, yeah.
Well, and I shouldn't say that. Not everybody does that.
No, not everybody does, but
Yeah.
the bigger ones do for sure.
The bigger ones do because they're leveraging their name. Think of it like a radio station.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's the new radio talk show kind of thing. And like everything these days, now you can binge it. Yeah, you get into one person, you haven't heard them for a while, so you can just start binging all of their episodes and things.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the key. When you do a podcast,
Mm-hmm.
it is about information. And it's not just about download my app, download my app, download my app. Okay. We actually run a podcast for Brilliant Breakthroughs, one of our other clients, which is Brilliant Breakthroughs, which is a book. It's the number one bestseller. In fact, they've got a fourth one coming out here soon. And one of our members is actually going to be an author in that one, Melinda. Melinda and her husband, Ryan, are going to be an author in that book when it comes out. And they've hit bestseller for the last 3 years, international bestseller last year.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I was actually part of the first edition, and we started a mobile app at that time. Well, every single time that we do a podcast, we are talking about the app. And what we're saying is to connect with the authors, download the app. To hear the podcast, download the app. Now, this is for them doing their own podcast. Okay. But when the authors are on other people's podcasts, like I don't have my own podcast. I am always just a guest on other people's, and they ask how to reach me. I mention the Brilliant Biz Book app because I am part of that app. So it's kind of like the Brookfield Chamber where I'm part of that app.
Mm-hmm.
But with the one through Brilliant Biz Book, they can actually contact me directly through that. Actually, they can through the Brookfield Chamber. Now that I'm saying this, I'm going to have to divide up based on who's my audience of where they can reach me. And so what's important is when you are talking about it, you want to talk about your business. You want to talk about this. And then throughout the podcast, you kind of drop it in that they can find more information about you through your app. Okay. So that's one of the pieces that's really important is how you deliver that message. And especially if your app is a free app, one that's just based on services, if you're going to be getting other sponsors to be paying for your app, in a way, when your app is free and you want people to do business with you, and you have to make it easy. Right now, what I would highly suggest is that you tell people exactly how to find it on the stores, or you have them go to your website and click the link to download the app. But that way, during any podcast, you want to be talking about it, but not over the top. You got to kind of balance that. Okay. And you have to give people like a reason to reference back to it.
Okay.
So what we'll say is, how to reach us. Oh, yes, you can reach us through the app. Or we may be saying, oh, you want a little blurb on each of the chapters? Check out our app. Each author does a short version of what they can find about the book, what they can find in their chapters and what's important about it. Give little segments and stuff. So that's how you would do it if it's not only your own podcast, but if you're a guest on somebody. Now, let's talk about audience. That's even more important because there's so many podcasts out there. to be a guest, be very discerning who you are a guest on the podcast. You have to make sure that it's a right fit for you and them. Now, ideally, their audience is your audience. Okay. And there's actually some companies out there now that will help you match the podcast. You can hire them to help you find out what podcast to be on. But the podcast itself is not the power. It's the advertising to get people to listen to the podcast. It's the exposure. That's where the power comes in a podcast. And that's why I like being guests on podcasts, because people will help put that out there. They will share over and over, come listen to the app mama, here it is. And then I can reshare that link. And these things are fairly evergreen. You want to make sure your interviews are evergreen and not just in the time. Like right now, I try very hard not to talk about COVID when I'm doing my podcast, because if somebody listens to that in 2 years from now, which happens, people do go back and listen to old podcasts, it's evergreen type material. They don't want to hear about COVID. At least let's hope in 2 years they don't want to hear about COVID, and they don't want to hear. Now I can use it as a example of how people shifted. The market then said, let's shift mobile. Mobile is becoming more popular because of the culture shift that we had, or the blip in the way we do business in the economy and how we had to shift. I'll talk about it that way. But that's because I do mobile apps. So it's a two-pronged thing. You want to make sure that their audience meets you. You also want to make sure that the host promotes you with not just with the app, but also with your business. Now, as far as the app promotion goes, a lot of times they have show notes that they put underneath the app or underneath the podcast. You want to make sure that you are giving your host the link to your app to put in the show notes. So not just your website, not just your email, not your phone number, if that's what you want to give them. You want to also give them the link to your app. And we do create a one link, which is like a smart link, where it knows no matter what device somebody's listening to this, it'll take them out to the proper stores. And you can also provide a QR code if that's what you want. But most of the time, people are listening to podcasts on their devices. The other thing you want to make sure is that the podcast isn't too long or too short. I have some podcasts where I'm on and they're 5 minutes. Literally rapid fire, 5-minute questions, boom. And they're okay, but they ask you 5 real rapid questions and go. There's some tactics to that of why they're doing that. A lot of times when you're asked to do a 5-minute podcast, be wary, because they're actually trying to get you, they're actually using the podcast to discern who you are and if you would make a good client to do business with them. And yeah, it's interesting. I've had that happen to me twice now. So I'm very conscious of not doing the 5-minute podcast. But you also don't want to go much past 30 minutes. People stop listening. It's a car ride. That's when everybody's listening to podcasts. It's a car ride. Okay? Now, on the flip side of this, you have to remember that the people listening to the podcast might not be your audience directly, but they might be your audience indirectly.
Okay.
And when I say that they might be your indirect audience, what that means is that the people listening might, like in your case, Stacy, have teenagers. Or the people listening may not be from the Brookfield area, but they have family in Wisconsin. Or they might not be, in the case of Melinda and Ryan's, they may not be fishermen, but their husbands might be, if it's a female audience. You don't always want to just rule it out because they are not your direct audience. You want to kind of see, where they're at. And you just never know where it leads to. Kind of like some people talk about Facebook and they're like, well, my audience isn't really on Facebook, they're more on LinkedIn. Well, that's true. However, you still don't want to eliminate Facebook as a tool for advertising because, people use LinkedIn for their business, but they play on social media and they might be on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram and see your stuff and go, wow, I need to check into that on Monday when I go back into my office, right? Or in the case of yours, Stacy, where your target audience is kids, not young kids, but, young adults is your audience. They may not live on Facebook, but their parents might. They may live on Instagram. So I'm not saying to eliminate podcasts when they're not your ideal audience, but you definitely want to have them be relative some way to your audience. Okay. The other thing you have to be careful about is when you are going to be on a podcast, how many followers do they have? What size audience do they have? If they only have an audience of 10, well, okay, you can do the podcast, but realize you're not going to get a lot of leverage out of it. And then definitely monitor your downloads right afterwards. See if it helped you at all. And if it was a podcast that helped you quite a bit, soar your numbers of downloads, or you started getting more social following, or you started doing a lot of those other things, then circle back with that guest, that host in 6 months or a year and ask if you can do it again.
Okay.
If it was a good, positive experience.
What number would you think would be a good option?
It depends. It depends what you're going for. I mean, really, if you look at Anna's app, that's very localized. There aren't a lot of people who are going to put this on their phone if they're not in the Wisconsin Brookfield area. They're not going to put it in, out in California, et cetera. So you want to, what kind of number would that be? And in your case, Stacy, you're going to help all kinds of kids. So you want to see, what would be reasonable to you as far as based on audience size. If their audience size is only 100 people listening to the podcast and you get 10 downloads, I think you got a good number. You got 10%, right? But if this is being listened to 50,000 people and you got 10 downloads, not so much.
Right.
So that's where you have to leverage the podcast. Now, if you do have a podcast yourself, a good way to get on other people's podcasts is to try to network with other podcasters and invite them into your show. Again, though, make sure that if they are in your show, that it's a topic that works for your audience, right? Mm-hmm. So I have a good friend of mine who hosts a podcast out in California. It's called Mind Your Own Business, right? And it's strictly for business people. And it's great, but I wouldn't recommend that the chamber goes on that one. His audience is all over the United States. It's not very localized. And you might get a little bit of replay from it, but not much. However, locally, there are several podcasters. We have Local First Milwaukee, and I think the chamber's actually been on that one. I'm almost certain. And I would be redoing that over and over again, but make sure that the app is talked about. Raise the app in your consciousness. That's the piece that's missing. Too many times I hear people that I know they have a mobile app and they never mentioned it in a podcast at all. This is your calling card. This is asking people to give you real estate on your phone. It is a way for them to listen to the podcast. Melinda's app with Ryan's podcast is right on there. It's a way for people to listen to the podcast. So if she's a guest on somebody else's podcast, she can very easily mention Ryan's app, or if Ryan is a guest, he can mention the Good Karma app and say, if you want to hear more about my podcast, it's on the app. It's giving people a reason to download it. But locally, and that might be the place to start, is with local people. We talked about the Local First. I know Lori Hybe has one social capital, I think it's called, or Capital Social, one of the two. And she works locally. And, really, truly, Anna, I would take a look and find out how many chamber members have podcasts.
There's quite a few. There's quite
Yeah.
a few, so I'll definitely reach out.
Yeah. Because even though their podcast may go all over, and I know Lori's does, I know you don't have to physically be here to record your episode with Lori.
Mhm.
And a lot of them, you don't have to always physically be there anymore. You can use Zoom to record the session now. Even though it starts local, that's a lot of where their network starts. Everybody starts close to home. That's how every business starts, no matter if you're virtual or not. You start close to home, right? And I started my networking with the Brookfield Chamber, and that will always be very dear to me because I started there.
Mhm.
And it's grown beyond. There's no question about it. But that's how I would leverage a podcast. Awesome. Kind of leveraging off of the podcast now is about social sharing on that and what you're doing. And every time you do a social share, you can do a long extended extra, on the bottom of the share where people do a lot of hashtags and they do that. You can put your link in there for your podcast and go from there. Plus, you can be sharing the podcast that you did. You want to not only share it socially, I would take those podcasts and I would house them on the website. All the recordings of the podcast, I would house them on the website, and I would direct people back to just that page. Not necessarily that episode, but to that page. To hear the latest podcast that we were on with Mind Your Own Business with Scott Sullivan, click here, and it just takes it back to that page. On that page, have your app links. In fact, there's one of our customers, and actually a couple of them, they put the app link up in the header. So on every single page, it's up there on the top, so people don't have to hunt for it. Make it easy. Excuse me. Make it easy for your customers. Because you want to make it inviting. Okay. The other thing that we do at Brilliant Biz Book is every Thursday we send out a push notice to remind people to listen to the podcast. So that's another thing that we do. The other thing that you want to do is when you are on podcasts, you want to make sure that you not only promote it, but that you start making comments on the podcast underneath the, wherever they've got it published. If they've got it on their, on the Apple, if they've got it on that podcast or wherever they're hosting it, you can put comments underneath it. And you want to get some of your friends to do the same thing, because that helps raise it up in the search engine. And you want to make sure that you have your links in there, because it raises up on the search engine without a doubt. And those things are really, really important. But when you are sharing it, I would be putting these links on your website, one page, podcast, that we've been guests on. Mm-hmm. Advertise who that person is, give them a backlink so that, you, like when I did the one with Scott, right there on the website, and then underneath it, for more by Scott, click here, because they will do the reciprocation for you. That's what's really important, because they have your website on their podcast. So you want to do the reciprocation. It's key. It's definitely key and critical to do that. But if you're not commenting on the podcast, the second part of not just being a guest, you want to make sure that you are.
Okay.
Because that's how you get seen. That's how you get heard. Think of it like a social post. You want to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. And then feel free to repost them later and later. I actually use a tool. I've turned most of my podcasts into blog articles. That's the other thing you can do. You can take that same podcast, you can turn it into blog articles. And then I use a tool that will republish that on social over a 1-year period of time. It will put it out on the different socials. It'll pepper it out throughout. So it takes every blog that I have posted, and then it automatically sets it up for 9 times over the next year. It's got a very specific how fast it goes out. And I said it and I forget it. Automation is a beautiful thing. I go in and it's there and people are commenting. Sometimes when I see them on my own social, I kind of look at it and I go, oh, yeah, I forgot I wrote that one. But I turn the podcast into a blog article and I turn clips from the podcast into social posts. And that's another way. And then on every social post, download our app, and you've got a very short link that you can add that in to the post. Definitely. So podcasting is it's a great way. The problem is right now, podcasts are so flooded. Everybody's doing a podcast. So finding places to be a guest on a podcast is not a problem, but be careful. When people post on social media, hey, I'm looking for guests for my podcast, that's great. Search out their podcast first to make sure that it aligns with you. If you're not into dog grooming, and it's all about how to groom dogs and what do they call that? Breed dogs and do all of that. Well, do you really want to be on it? I mean, what value are you going to bring to that podcast? And that's really important, is to make sure that you do that. And you want to make sure that what you have in there is definitely shareable, without a doubt. Also, another good way to be seen on this is when you've done a podcast and you think somebody else can benefit from being a guest on that podcast, do an introduction. I do that when I find that people want to be on certain podcasts. I will do introductions to the host, because I have found that way the host, it's amazing how they'll recycle your podcast through and share it even more, the more you're telling people to go to that. Because also when your friends and whatnot are on those episodes, you want to start sharing that, because it'll lead people back to your episode as well. So it's not just about a one and done type thing.
The podcast, the blog, what is that program?
Basically what I do is I use, you can use different translators. I've used Otter as one, Otter, which has translated it into text. Okay. And there's other ways you can translate it into text. Now be mindful though, that when you do translate it into text, it does need to be edited. Okay. And Otter is a pretty good one. There's a couple of others as well that are out there, and some cost money, some don't. It all depends upon what it is. I'm trying to think right offhand of another one that I've used in the Temi. That's the other one that I've used, is Temi. Temi is actually is even a little better than Otter as far as recognizing the voice. And you can also ask your hosts, did you do a transcript? Can I have the script as well? So sometimes the hosts do that, where they put, as they call it, the show notes. They'll do the whole thing right underneath it. And you can even just go on and take a look at where they've posted your podcast to see if it's all right there. And then you can just take that, turn that into a blog, add a nice image, have the link in there for people to listen to. Boom. Okay. It's just a great way to do it. The other thing is, when you're going through the podcast, you can listen to it yourself or review the notes yourself. You may have several blog articles right there from just wisdom and brilliance that you said that you forgot that you said. I've done that already, where it's like, oh, wow, that was pretty brilliant of me to come up with that. Mm-hmm. And now, boom, I can write a blog about that. If you're on a podcast, save it and upload it to YouTube. So what you want to do to create it into a video is you can use any kind of a video type of a maker like Movavi or something that are relatively inexpensive. You can just put one single image, and that image can be, I was a guest on Mind Your Own Business with Scott Sullivan, and I have your own contact information. It can be down there, and the blog then the podcast can then come across on the YouTube, and it's giving you more content for your YouTube, and you haven't done anything. You've had to just take a few minutes and repurpose the content in different areas, in different places. So podcasts can be very, very powerful, very powerful. The biggest thing is just to make sure your message aligns with the guest, or, with the host. that your message definitely aligns. And same thing if you're hosting your own podcast, make sure your own guests will help you promote you. And that's really, really important.